Hey, what's up YouTube? This is Hey Guys Laughing Out Loud back again with another video. Today's video is the first of a series of video courses on how to use a DS4 Pro controller with the Steam software. This is an intro level course. For those of you who are new to the software, please do not let the user interface or the large amount of information overwhelm and intimidate you, as there is a lot to learn to get the most out of this software. Now, the whole point of these videos that I will be making, as this being the intro, is to break down each section so it's digestible. Furthermore, I also want to recommend that you guys check out the following Steam controller YouTube channels. That'll be Existential Egg, Critical Composer, and the Steam Controller Fan Club. The links will be in the description below. I want to mention that those particular YouTube channels will be focused on the Steam controller itself. My channel will be focused purely on the DS4 controller and the DS4 Pro controller with the Steam software. Now, the Steam software was created by Valve and it was released with the Steam controller November 10th, 2015. And it was intended and used on the Windows PC and the Steam machine. Basically what it does is allows gamers to customize their control scheme beyond the standard button remapping. And just as a side note, this software is legal and will not get you banned. The software supports the Steam controller, the Xbox controller, and of course the DS4 controller, which, as I mentioned earlier, will be the focus of this channel. Now, this software basically combines the best of both worlds in regards to keyboard and mouse and the controller all into one. It gives you the option for button remapping, multi-button actions, and advanced actions such as using action sets and action layers. And don't worry if you don't know what that means, we'll get into that. But before we get started, I want to say that each section from here on out in this video will be just a brief overview of that specific feature within the Steam software. I will later make a dedicated video to fully explain that feature, along with giving various examples on how to use it. Now, let's get into the first topic of discussion, which is profiles. Now, obviously, what we're looking at here is a standard gamepad profile within the Steam controller, or excuse me, within the Steam software. And this is a button configuration for the DS4 controller. And you have the ability to obviously, configure this configuration, this profile, if you will, however you see fit. And then you can export out your own personal config. You can save it as your personal binding. You can save it as a local binding, so it's saved on your computer. Saved personal bindings will be uploaded to a cloud on your Steam account. You also have the option of your friends, sharing with your friends. You have community profiles. You have community templates that you can export to. And you've got your other games. Those you won't spend too much time in, but just mentioning it. And then that's for exporting. So you can export out. And then for importing, let's say you're learning the software, you don't quite know how to do it, or maybe somebody wants to share a config, or maybe you have a config you saved and you want to go back to it and load it, whatever. So you can go to the import option. You've got your recommended profiles. You've got your personal profiles, which you can go in and apply that. You got your friends. So if a friend has a profile they want to share with you, you grab that. You got your community, your templates, and again your other games. So you literally have all these different options for profiles and the creation for your controllers. One thing I do want to mention is when you create a profile, it is going to be for that specific type of controller. So, for example, you cannot import a profile that has been made for the Xbox controller or the Steam controller and vice versa. It has to be for that particular type of controller. So just, throwing that out there in case somebody made you a profile, but it's for the Steam controller and you want to use it for the DS4, you can't do that. Not yet. Now, maybe in the future, but not right now. So the next thing we want to get into, and what is one of the main reasons why a lot of us would want to maybe use a program like this, is the ability to button remap. Now, if you notice here, we've got our triangle, square, circle, and X down at the bottom lower right, which is highlighted, and those buttons are mapped to the Xbox configuration buttons. And the reason why is when Valve created the Steam controller, the button configurations on the controller are Y, X, B, and A. So they basically mimicked the Xbox controller button config. So that's why it's labeled in that way, but it doesn't really matter. So let's say you want to go in and you want to remap buttons. Okay, well, the Y button, which would be your triangle button on the PlayStation controller, well, let's say you want to map that to your A button. Okay, well, you can remove it by hitting square, and then you can go ahead and select your A button and apply it. Now, you've got your A button set to where your triangle would be, and now, let's say you want to switch your Y button or your A button with Y, so you can remove your A and apply it to Y. So now you've remapped your A and Y buttons. This is basic, again, this is just basic examples of, button remapping. So I want to mention that you can remap every single button on these controllers without any problem, except for one button, and that's going to be your home button. And the reason why is that is going to be your key to getting into the configuration whenever you're setting up your profile for whatever game or software you're utilizing it for. Also, should just mention real quickly, you can use this software for video games, obviously, but you can also use it for software packages within Windows, and you can use it for desktop Windows usage if you so desire. We'll get into that in another video. All right, so now we've discussed button remapping. Now we're going to get into what is known as activators. So I'm going to go back into what we remapped for the A button. I'm going to go into my activators. Again, don't let this overwhelm you because I will break all this down in its own dedicated video. In the activators section, you have options for how that button is going to be activated. What that means is when you press the well, it's now, let me reset this. Let me exit out of this so I do not confuse you guys. So I'm going to go back and set the default for that. So I've applied it. So everything is back to default. Don't worry about how I did it. I will show you that at another time. I basically just went to the profiles. So I go back into my button configuration. So I'm going to go into the Y button. I'm going to go to my activators. And in the activators, you have different options for when you press that button. So my Y would be my triangle. And you've got regular press. So when I press that button, which is the default, when I press that button, it's just going to execute as a normal button. But you've got different options. So you've got double press. So if I set it to double press, now when I go to press the Y button, I double press it in order to execute that button command. And down here, you can adjust how fast or slow you want to have that double press be, or how you wish to tailor it. Another option is you have long press, so you can actually set it to where you can press and hold that button, and you can adjust how long you hold that button, and that will at that point activate that button press. Then you have what is known as start and release press, and you generally want to use those buttons in conjunction together. You'll generally want to use the start button as one press and the release button as another press. Again, if you don't understand what I'm saying, don't worry about it. I will explain all that in the more detailed video. The next thing I want to discuss is the toggle on and off feature. By default, it is set to off. Now, if you set it to turn on, now what you can do is, let's say, for example, my Y button, let's just say it was my block button. Okay, well, if I don't want to hold my block button down while I'm blocking, I can now turn on the toggle. Now when I go to press the Y button, it is going to turn on the block, and it's going to hold that down within the software, and you can let go of it physically. So now you're free to do whatever you want. In order to disable it, you have to press the button again. There's a time and a place for the toggle, but just showing you that that is an option for you. You also have the option for hold and for repeat, which is going to be your turbo feature. And you can turn it on and off. I'm going to go ahead and turn it on, and you've got the option of how slow or fast you wish to put it. I will admit the adjustment on this is not very good. I wish Valve would put a little more work into this, but there's a lot of work that this software needs, in my opinion, or could use to make it even better. But it works. You just don't have a lot of leeway on the repeat rate as I would like. But it works very good. So you can hold the button down instead of spamming it. You can hold the button down and it will, fire consecutively. Works great for games like, if any of you are familiar with the game Cuphead, well, when you hold the fire button down by default in the game in Cuphead, it's already set to turbo. So you don't need turbo in a game like that. But if you go to play an old school game like, let's say, Metroid on an NES emulator, something like that, you don't have turbo on that. So let's say you wanted to fire consecutively, by just holding down the button, you'd want to turn on your turbo. It's just an example. Okay, so that explains activators. Now we're going to get into the various ways. The next section is going to discuss the various ways of your control movement with the controller. Now, before I get into this, one of the reasons why I push so hard or so heavily for the DS4 controller over the Steam controller, without getting in too much of a review and a digression, is the Steam controller only has 2 rear buttons to utilize for button mapping, while the Pro controller has 4. And for those of you who cannot see those buttons because they are black and they kind of blend in really well, I have my old rear button shell from my original Pro controller build that I've taken out. And these are obviously red, so you can see them. You have 4 buttons that you can assign. And generally what I do is I assign my front face buttons to these rear buttons here. And in the future videos, I will label where I assign those buttons just to avoid confusion. But just as real quickly, I generally map my Y and X button on, when you're looking at it here on the video on the right, and I do my B and A button on the left. However, when you flip it over, obviously that changes over, so Y and X is going to be on the left and B and A is going to be on the right. I probably just confused you guys. You can go back and hopefully listen to it again. Maybe you'll get it. Anyways, moving on. So one of the advantages of using a Pro controller versus a Steam controller, again, this is just my opinion. I won't say that it's better, because I believe in using the right tool for the right job. And it is my opinion that for the games that I play, the types of games that I play, and for the way that I play, I feel that the DS4 Pro controller is far superior than the Steam controller. But I'm sure there's going to be a situation where the Steam controller might be the more desired way to go. The main reason I don't care for this controller, aside from the fact that there's only 2 buttons on the back, is this controller is very cheaply made. It just doesn't feel good in the hands. Ergonomics wise, it feels good. The thumb pads, the touch pads, feels good. That's about the only thing I particularly like about this controller. But aside from that, this controller feels straight up like dog shit. I don't like it. So this controller feels really good in the hands. And a Pro controller versus a standard DS4 controller feels much better. Anyways, the point of using a DS4 Pro controller is it allows you to keep your thumbs on the left and right thumbstick at all times during gameplay, so you can utilize your 4 rear buttons and your triggers and bumpers without ever having to take your thumbs off the left and right thumbsticks to utilize the D-pad and front face buttons. And some of you are probably wondering, well, how do you utilize them? Well, that's when you get into button remapping, action sets, and action layers. And I will show you guys how to do that in the future once you guys learn to run. This video is teaching you to crawl. My next videos will teach you to walk. My final videos will teach you guys to run. Anyways, moving on, we're going to get into the control movement options within the Steam software. Now, obviously, you do have your D-pad, so you can go in, you can control your, set up your D-pad, leave it as default if you want, or you can remap it to WASD, WASD, or you can remap it to your up, down, left, and right arrows, should you need to go with a keyboard configuration. The next option is your analog left joystick. If your game supports analog joystick in conjunction with, or if it supports it, then you can just go with that. If it does not, you can go with a D-pad and set it up as a D-pad. Now, some of you are probably wondering, well, if you do that, you lose analog mobility. I will teach you how to set it up where it feels just like an analog joystick. It feels exactly the same, no problem at all. And again, that'll be in the more advanced courses. So you've got your joystick move, which is generally going to be for your forward, back, left, and right. And then you've got your camera movement, which is going to be your right thumbstick. So your right thumbstick, as I said, is going to be your camera movement. And you can use the default camera analog movement if you so desire. I prefer to use the mouse joystick or joystick mouse, which basically turns your analog stick into a mouse. This opens up a lot of configuration options and sensitivity levels, again, based on the game, of course. But for most games, it opens up a lot of doors. And you can get a lot more flexibility and movement control by going with the joystick mouse. The next option you have, and the final option, is your gyro controls, which is your motion control support. And that is another reason why I chose to go with the DS4 controller over the Steam controller and the Xbox controller. The Steam controller does in fact support gyro motion control support, which is what helped me a lot with aiming, because I have problems aiming within games without it. Xbox controller does not support gyro support, so that's out the door. You can't use it. Not for this. So obviously the DS4 controller does support motion controls, gyro support. So you can go into your gyro here. You can set it up as mouse or mouse joystick. Preferred to go with mouse. That's generally the preferred. And you can go in and you can set it to always on. So whenever that particular action set is set up, it's always on. And then you can move the controller however you want to aim with. Or you can set it to a specific button, like maybe your left trigger. Maybe you want to have it set to draw your bow. Maybe you have a bow and you're going to shoot a bow. So you pull down your left trigger and it also activates your gyro. And now you're aiming with your controller. And for those of you who are wondering if it's accurate, it is accurate. There are certain things that you need to know in order to help get it tweaked correctly. And I don't want to give the impression that there's a lot of work involved to do it, because there really isn't. But in the bugs, fixes, you know, and workarounds video, I will discuss some tweaks and options on how to do that should you guys run into problems. I have only ran into one game where on the PC and Windows that I have not been able to utilize the motion controls for, and that is Resident Evil 7. And that is because that game was poorly ported. I won't get into the specifics of that because that's a whole nother discussion. But for the most part, this is a great feature to go with. And is, like I said, is also a feature found on the Steam controller. As far as which works better between the Steam controller and the DS4 controller for this particular feature, I found it to work about the same. It doesn't work any better or worse. So that just covers the topic of control movement. Now we're going to get into another real short topic of touchpad. So obviously you've got a touchpad on your DS4 controller. So on the DS4 controller, you can configure your touchpad and you can set it up to do all kinds of different things. You can have it as a directional pad, a button pad, a mouse joystick move, scroll wheel, touch menu. I mean, you've got all these different options. Again, I will cover this in another video more in depth to give you guys some examples. One other thing you can do that you can't do on a PlayStation controller is you can split them by going up to the swap to split pad. So now you have two thumbstick pads here. And the way that works is if you go and touch the left thumbstick pad, you can literally use the whole pad as the left thumbsticks, provided you don't pick up your finger off the thumbstick pad. As long as you start on the left and you go towards the right, if you need to go to the right, it remains on that particular touchpad for the left side, and same for the right. And you can set each of these up, as I mentioned earlier, for its own designated feature. Very, very cool stuff. And I'll show you some of the options and ways that I use it within my games. You can use it for menus, you can use it for media, you can do all kinds of different stuff with that. Now, of course, I mentioned earlier, the whole point of using a Pro controller is being able to play the game without taking your thumbs off the thumbsticks. Yes, I generally use the touchpads for things that are not specific within the game, not like active gameplay. So again, I'll give examples in a later video. All right, the next topic I want to discuss is action sets. Now, action sets are, right now in this particular profile, you can't see it, but we are looking at a default action set. The profile is called gamepad. Now, I want to add an action set, and I'll explain what it is as I add it. So I add the action set. I give it a name. I'm going to go ahead and call this Gamepad 2. Now, when you give it a name, you have the option of either leaving that action set blank, so you can plug in everything manually, or you can copy it. In this instance, I'm going to copy it. So it's going to copy the default. I hit OK, and now we have two action sets that are identical. Now, what this does is it allows you to switch between, you'll have to set up, obviously, a button to do this, to switch between each action set. Now, some of you may be wondering, why would you want to do that? I will give just a simple example here. Again, this will be in the more advanced videos. I typically like to set up my default action set, which I normally call menu. I set that up as a normal DS4 controller scheme. And I set it to where whenever I go into my game and I go into an options menu or a map menu or quest menu or something of that nature, I can go ahead and utilize the standard default controller configuration. And then for my second configuration, my second action set, that action set I set up to be specific to my gameplay. And it usually never matches whatever it is on the default. And then I just switch between the two as needed. So whenever I need to go to my map, I just hit my map menu button and it automatically switches to my default configuration. And then now I can use the standard configuration. Let me give you an example further. Let's say in my Gamepad 2 configuration, I had my Y button for turbo. Well, if I were to go to my map menu and I was trying to navigate through my menus and I hit my Y button, it's going to be set to turbo and it could execute the turbo in a way I don't want it to. So in order to avoid that, I just create a whole new button configuration for that. Or let's say in your second action set here, the Gamepad 2, let's say you want it's all set up to keyboard and mouse configurations, but you want your default to be all your standard default controller configurations. This allows you to switch between the two. Again, don't let this confuse you. Don't worry about me not explaining it very well. Again, this is just an overview. But I'm sure you get the idea. So the next thing I want to cover, and I'm going to come back to the action set again in just a second, but the next thing I want to cover is action layers. Now, action layers work very much like Photoshop layers. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Photoshop layers, just do a YouTube search for Photoshop layers and how they work. And if you don't understand, and I'm sure with that, it'll kind of give you an idea better explained from this video on how it works. And when I go to create the video for this, it'll be even further explained. So you'll definitely know by then. So action layers are specific to each action set. So if you noticed, I'm currently on my default action set. Now I'm on my Gamepad 2 action set. I'm going to switch back and forth between the two. If you notice, the default does not have an AL1 action layer. Only my Gamepad 2 does. And that's because my action layer is specific to that action set. So before we proceed forward, well, let me go ahead and explain the action layer. So what action layers does is when you select it, typically what it's good for and what you're going to want to use it for is you want to set a button. I'll go ahead and use my left trigger here. I'll go in and I'm going to remove my left trigger. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to set to apply action layer. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to select AL1 as the action layer I want to activate. And now when I hit my left trigger, it is now going to apply that action layer. And it's going to remain on until I remove it. Now, in order to remove it, I need to go in and I need to, I'm getting more descriptive than I really should, but I'll just go ahead and do it here. I'm going to go ahead and set remove action layer. I'm going to leave it as AL1. And now when I hit that button again, it's going to remove that action layer. I do not recommend doing it this way. The best way to do it is to go in, set your activator to release press for the remove action layer, and then for the apply action layer, I recommend setting that to start press. And what that does is as you press down, it's already done the start press. You have not released it. So now you've activated that layer. Now you're free to go in and utilize that action layer. The action layer works as a shift key, very much like in Photoshop, where if you're using layers in Photoshop, it acts like a shift key. Now you can remap all these buttons here, and while you've got that left trigger held, you are now utilizing a separate set of button commands. And just as a side note, you do not have to use the same button to remove the action layer. You only need to do it if it's a momentary hold, as I've set this one up. You can actually set the action layer up to be a switch to that action layer where you hit the button and you let go and it activates the layer, and then you can have a different button to remove it. Again, that's getting way too advanced for this video, but I kind of felt I needed to explain it to a certain degree so you guys know what they are, because it's basically just a shift, think of it like a shift button. I guess that would have been a shorter description. But anyways, we got two more quick topics to discuss. Actually three. So I mentioned earlier, when you go to create a action set, that you have the option of creating duplicates. Okay, so earlier I created a duplicate of my default, and I created a duplicate and that duplicated the default. Well, I'm going to go ahead and create a duplicate of gamepad 2. So now we've got a third action set. We're not talking about the action layer. We're talking about the action sets here. I know this can be confusing. So if you notice in my new action set for gamepad 3, if you notice, there is no action layer there. It did not duplicate my action layers from gamepad 2. See, gamepad 2 has action layer 1, but it does not have action layer 1 duplicated. Now, I don't know if this would be considered a bug. I'm not sure. I don't know what the developers were intending. I can say I wish it did duplicate it, because it would save a lot of time. But unfortunately it does not. So what that means is, if you create an action set and you want to duplicate that action set, you can, but you're going to have to still go in and create all the different action layers again for that action set. Yes, it sucks, because it can be a lot of work having to do that. But in the advanced course, some of the final courses that I offer or will be offering, I will show you a faster way, a workaround to that, which obviously incorporates profiles. So now we're done with that. Now we want to discuss two final things. Always on actions. Oh, nope, three final things. Whoops, my bad. We've got always on actions. Now let me go back to gamepad 2 action set. Now, if you notice here that I've got highlighted that little infinity symbol there, that is your always on action button. So if you go in there, you can now bind any button command, and let's say I bind it to the button 3. Okay, now when this action set is activated, that button 3 is always going to be held. I do not recommend using the always on action sets. I recommend using them on action layers. But I do want to mention, I'm not telling you that you can't do it. You can, but you're going to run into problems, which I will mention and explain in more detail in the bugs, fixes, and workarounds. But I will tell you the problem that you'll run into. If you remember earlier, I mentioned that the controller allows you to fully remap all buttons except the PS home button, because you need that in order to get into your button configurations when you're playing your game in order to make changes. Well, if you have the always on action button activated, meaning you've got it mapped to a button, it doesn't matter what it's mapped to, it basically breaks this home button and you will not be able to get into your configuration. So as a workaround, and what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to apply your always on action to an action layer. So now whenever you activate that layer, it activates that always on action. I'll give you a quick example of a time when you may want to use it. I play a game called The Witcher 3. In The Witcher 3, there's an option to parry. Well, I don't really want to hold my parry button the whole time. So what I do is I'll switch to this action layer. It'll automatically parry while because it's being held down, and I can go ahead and execute my other button commands. And then when I'm done, I swap out of that mode back into my normal default mode. It deactivates it and still allows me to get into my button configuration. You can, in fact, get back into your button configuration by switching action sets, very similar to disabling or removing your action layers. That is another way to do it and another workaround. But again, I still don't recommend that. I highly recommend going with the action layers. I don't want to tell you you can't do it. It's just a recommendation to prevent running into problems during your gameplay. Okay, so we've got that out of the way. Now, one final thing we want to discuss. Well, two. The last thing isn't really going to be discussed too much, is mode shifting. Now, this will probably be one of the last videos I make for the introduction courses because I don't utilize this feature very much, and I don't imagine any of you will be either. The reason why is because we have action layers. Action layers are fairly new. I believe they were introduced last fall, around October, November of 2017. And a lot of us didn't really know what they were. So there weren't any videos on it. And when I went to use it, the explanation of how to use it and what it could do wasn't very good. So I actually didn't start using them until late December. But before that, we used what is known as mode shifting, which works similar to action layers, but is nowhere near as good. So what mode shifting does is it allows you to go in and you go into your mode shift, you select the style of buttons. Again, this is probably not going to make sense because I'm going to have to do a whole video on this specifically. And you can set, let's say I'll set my left trigger full pull to that. Okay, now whenever I pull my left trigger, it acts as a shift button, very much like your action layer. And now I can remap all these buttons to that mode shift. The reason why I recommend action layers over mode shift is because this is very limited. You only can bind buttons to that specific style of input, which is your button pad. I mean, of course, you can change it. You know, you can go to directional pad if you want, or you can go to joystick mouse or something like that. But you're limited just to that one feature. With action layers, you can do the entire controller with the exception of the home button and the actual button to activate and remove that particular shift. So that's you might be able to see why I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the mode shift. It's kind of like what CDs were. Think of it as a CD, but now with action layers, we're now using digital media. You know, action layers is digital media, mode shift is your CDs. Nobody uses CDs anymore. Maybe some do, but most people don't. So anyways, that is a brief description of mode shift. Final topic of discussion, bugs, fixes, and workarounds. Actually, I'm not really going to discuss that much here. I'm going to create a whole separate video for that. But what I do want to mention is this software does have bugs. This software does break on occasion. And I have done quite a bit of that. I have spent countless hours learning the ins and outs of this software, both with the Steam controller, the Xbox controller, and the DS4 controller. I I have gotten beyond pissed off at this software, failed, and failed time again, trying to get this software to do what I want it to do. And the only help I had was some of the YouTube videos from some of the YouTubers that I mentioned previously. And not to throw them under the bus, as I have been very appreciative of their videos. But the problem with a lot of those videos, and where I hope to stand out from them, aside from using a Pro controller and a DS4 controller, is they don't really break the tutorials down in a way for beginners. Most of their videos come off as you already know how to use the Steam software or software like it. And for somebody like myself who is somewhat tech savvy, who does use computers on a regular basis, I still had a lot of problems learning this software. So if you take somebody who's not tech savvy, who doesn't generally know software that well, I don't imagine you're going to bother with this. So my goal is to hopefully break these intro videos down for all these sections to, like I said, get you guys to the point where you can crawl, then walk, and then run. The YouTubers I mentioned earlier, those guys are making videos that are more for people who already know how to walk and run. And again, I'm not throwing them under the bus. I highly recommend you going and checking them out. They have been very helpful to me, but they've also been very frustrating too, because they don't know how to teach very well. Some of them. I don't want to say all of them, because and I don't claim that I do either, because it can be difficult sometimes teaching, because we assume our viewers know what we're talking about, but oftentimes they don't. So one of the reasons why I want to break down each of the sections of the controller to its own video is to also make it more simple for the comments when people run into problems or questions or concerns. It's about that specific topic. So it makes it a little bit easier for me to help you and the viewers to hopefully fix your problems, or maybe another viewer has already run into that problem, found a fix for it, and they can reply and respond. And that's been a big problem with some of the previous YouTubers that I've dealt with when watching their videos. Again, I'm not here to throw them under the bus. Like I said, I definitely encourage you to watch their videos. I think for some people who may be more advanced with the software, or maybe more tech savvy, you may be able to pick up on, the chemistry may be good for you to pick up on some of the things they say. When I watch their videos now, I understand pretty much the majority of what they say, but that's because I know this software almost inside and out now. But if you take somebody who doesn't know this software, or isn't really tech savvy, I just don't think they're the good place to start. And I'm hoping that these videos that I create will be a good place to start. And one of the reasons also I want to mention as well is this software does have tooltips, but the narrative, meaning the explanation of what each of these options is for, it's not very good. It's not explained very well. It's gotten better. I will admit, because I've seen the evolution even in a year's time, because I've been using the software for about a year now. It has gotten better, but it still is, it's still not very user friendly. So anyways, that is the end of this intro course for using the Steam controller software with a DS4 Pro controller. My first video and next video on this particular course will be profiles, and followed by button remapping, activators, control movement, touchpad, action sets, action layers, always on actions, mode shift, and then bugs and fixes and workarounds. And as always, guys, Please leave dislikes, and comments below. And keep gaming, guys.